Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153, and this is our class for Thursday on the 6th. And our current topic happens to be on magazines, and that happens to be in chapter 9. And as you know, I'm also encouraging you to think about your final project. Thank you for all of you who have contacted me about ideas with your final project. If you haven't done so already, please do so soon, so that you've got enough time to be able to work on that particular final project. Though your project is not due until the very ending of the semester, but since we're already in August, the ending of the semester will come sooner rather than later. And in terms of thinking about magazines, we talked a little bit about newspapers, and we talked a little bit about journalism, and we also talked a little bit about books. But magazines focus on specific demographic groups. So the idea of the magazine is that it was specialized in a way that we didn't necessarily see newspapers become specialized. And it highly focuses on visuals, as I'm sure you're quite aware. And in the age prior to television, it was very useful to have those visuals. The paper is of higher quality than newsprint, so that's the idea of a magazine is supposed to have a certain level of permanence that you might not necessarily have with a newspaper. Though we had talked a little bit about how sometimes newspapers were used to document historical records and were saved in that manner, but it's more difficult to keep a newspaper over a long period of time without the paper degrading than it would be with a magazine. And newspapers are oftentimes dailies, and magazines are usually not daily, if we're thinking about some of the distinctions between the magazine and the newspaper. The history of the magazine starts in the mid-1700s in France, and it comes from the French word magasin, which means storehouse, which is what a magazine really is. It's a storehouse of information. Though, as we've been talking about over the course of the semester, it also happens to be a storehouse for advertising, which one could say is the case for all media outlets. It developed rather slowly in colonial America. It was mostly geared towards politicians, the educated, and merchants. It was higher priced than something like a newspaper, so therefore you needed to have a certain level of affluence. Initially, it was text-driven until we had enough technology so that it could be visually driven, which led to a whole new level of journalism, since we've talked about journalism as well. Photojournalism, photos rather than text documenting life and historical events. So, if we want to think a little bit about the power of magazines over time, in the mid-1900s, it was the Reader's Digest, and basically that was a magazine that was devoted to condensed republications. It had at one point the highest U.S. and global circulation. By this particular point in time, the costs of magazines were reduced enough through things like the Industrial Revolution so that it was accessible to a larger group of people, and also with time, literacy rates increased as well. The TV Guide in the late 80s or so was the #1 magazine in the United States. Not too surprisingly, because that's also the heyday of television, which we will be talking about when we get to the television section. And the TV Guide is also related to someone that I've mentioned in previous classes, Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, a very savvy businessman, purchased the TV Guide in the late 1980s, and he had a very definite reason for doing so. He basically was launching a new television network at a time where basically there were 3 major networks: ABC, NBC, CBS. Those were the main players, and there really wasn't the kind of access that we have today for cable. So when we get to the television section, we'll talk about that the early days of television were rather unique in that it was a shared cultural experience just because there were so few options for viewing or for other media forms to engage in during the time. So you've got a group of people that basically have a shared history based on things like television programming. And again, since there were so few options, ABC, NBC, CBS, there's a very high likelihood that most people were watching a particular show, so that was something that bonded individuals together. That said, the TV Guide basically published, in addition to articles about television personalities, the television listings, and that wasn't something that was available in a widespread way. So in order to know what the programming was, people would buy the TV Guide, which is why it was the #1 magazine at the time. Rupert Murdoch understood that if he wanted to launch a new television network, which was considered impossible during that time because the three big networks had such a hold on the television audience, he understood that if he purchased the TV Guide, he would be able to run listings for his new television network, which he called Fox. And that basically became the fourth player in terms of the four major networks. And then, of course, he launched Fox News, and the rest is history, as we've talked about, certainly in our journalism section. But it was a very savvy business move for him to break into the television industry by purchasing the TV Guide. But the TV Guide is no longer necessarily the most popular magazine. That said, AARP has oftentimes been identified as the most read magazine just because of demographics in our time period. Tabloids. It's a dirty little secret that neither newspapers or the magazine industry want to accept. Neither one of them wants to claim ownership of the tabloids, where you've got some really lurid sensationalism. Though you could argue, and I think we would argue, that newspapers as a whole have become more tabloid-like. In part, I would argue, because of the Fox effect. The importance of the Fox News network is that they were really the beginning of what's led to some of our current challenges in relation to getting information and having that information vetted through a journalistic means. But newspapers say that although tabloids use newsprint, much like newspapers do, newspapers don't want to claim any kind of ownership for them. The magazine industry says that they don't want to claim any ownership for tabloids, though oftentimes their content is presented much like the content would be presented in a magazine as opposed to a newspaper. When we think about magazines, they really were able to not only focus on particular demographics. I believe I mentioned in a previous class some scholarship that was done for an essay entitled The Cult of True Womanhood, where magazines from the 1800s were reviewed to get a sense as to how the female was viewed in society. So the early days of magazines, in fact, just like the early days of advertising, oftentimes those were geared towards females because they were viewed as the primary consumers. The irony, however, is that the content was put together by males. So the presentation they gave a female oftentimes wasn't accurate, or oftentimes was skewed or stereotypical, which is something that Gene Kilborn talks about in Killing Us Softly. But that said, not only can you have a magazine target a particular demographic based on something like age or based on something like a hobby or an interest, you can have even demographic editions of particular magazines. So these are specific editions of a particular publication that are targeted to a particular demographic group. Something even like a zip code, where you've got articles and advertising that basically are geared towards people living in that particular area, even though it's a magazine that has national readership. Of course, with all of these pieces of media that we've discussed thus far, you know that the internet has completely changed the way the media is presented and how we consume it. Webzines were exclusively online. If you think of something like Salon, which still has a good amount of power in the magazine world. And I would say that magazines, much like newspapers and to some extent books, have been negatively impacted by the internet, and that readership has perhaps moved away from them. But that's not to say that people still aren't consuming the content. They're just consuming it in a different way. And the idea of the magazine providing a tactile experience somewhat similar to books is one of the reasons that perhaps magazines haven't suffered as much as newspapers have in terms of decreases in circulation. If you've ever had the experience of touching a newspaper and having the print on your fingers, then you know that that's a rather unpleasant experience as compared to something like a magazine with its glossy pages, and it's a much more satisfying experience. And it's also very convenient. Magazines still are oftentimes found in situations where people are in waiting rooms, or at least they were found in situations when people were in waiting rooms prior to our current time. So that said, I thought what would be very interesting for you to view would be a TED Talk that I found that talked about a particular magazine, The New Yorker. Happens to be a very prestigious magazine. It's geared definitely to an educated group of readers. And this TED Talk, rather short, I believe it's only 10 or 15 minutes if I'm correct. It talks a little bit about the covers of the magazines and some of the thought that went into the covers and some of the ways the covers can be analyzed and interpreted from a consumer's perspective and also from a publishing perspective. And after you've watched that, your assignment for today is going to be to do a little bit of research. So today's video is going to be somewhat short so that you can do that research. And what I would like you to do is to basically find an interesting magazine cover. Now, the magazine can be accessed in any of a number of ways. You might have hard copies that you have access to. That's fantastic. But you might be searching online for the electronic version of that magazine. That's also fine. Spend no more than an hour or so looking around, because that's basically what we would have been doing in class, to identify an interesting magazine cover, and then for you to indicate why you think that magazine cover is interesting. So that's going to be our class forum discussion question. Certainly feel free to attach the image of the magazine cover to the form, but if it turns out that you're having some technical issues and you aren't able to do that, it suffices for you to describe the magazine cover. What's more interesting is not the magazine that you choose, but your reasoning for choosing it, which is again pretty similar to the kinds of questions that I ask. And analyze it as much or as little as you'd like. As you can see, the TED Talk with the stories behind the New Yorker's iconic covers just begins to touch the surface of how you can go about doing that. So I very much look forward to seeing what you and your classmates come up with in relation to magazine covers. The cover is particularly important because that's what catches the eye of the reader, and that oftentimes determines if a reader is going to be reading that magazine or purchasing it, especially when you're doing magazines not through a subscription basis but through newsstand purchases. So it needs to definitely be catchy. And while that's sometimes the case with book covers, that's not necessarily always the case with book covers. And again, with newspapers, oftentimes it's the headline, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the headline. And it's the same with magazines. It could be that you happen to be a loyal follower and that the cover isn't very much important to you. But more often than not, because a magazine is so highly visual, the cover has a particular kind of significance to it. And we saw when Jean Kilbourne was analyzing advertisements, she sometimes talked about magazine covers. And the contrast between, let's say, some of the articles that would be promoted on the cover, things like weight loss tips and techniques, and then, of course, what we see on the cover itself, which happens to be let's say, a very luscious piece of dessert that might be advertised with a recipe that you could find inside. So how do you reconcile those two mixed messages? Or perhaps you're getting a very similar kind of message in the fact that the cover of the magazine is very much promoting particular social attitudes and values and beliefs. in our own society. So have fun with this assignment and look around. Ask people you know about the magazines they consume, if they still consume magazines. And we'll talk some more soon. Take care. Bye-bye.